The big thing to understand about Infinity Blade Dungeons is it's not a evolution of Infinity Blade. It's not the sort of the next iteration of Infinity Blade. It's a completely different game. And the way it came about really was actually a passion project inside the studio. Is what we did after we shipped Gears 3 is we did a game jam in the studio where we let a bunch of people self-organize into teams and come up with a week of just working in the engine, see what kind of fun things they could make. And I think it was about a group of 7 guys came up with this idea of like, let's do a dungeon crawler. And they started building that up, and after the week we kind of reviewed all the different prospects, and it sort of resonated within the company. Everybody really loves fantasy. You can tell by our art style, the artists really love that kind of hardcore fantasy stuff. So this seemed to be something that could be really interesting, because also not only was it interesting from a content perspective, but it was also interesting from a technology perspective, because up to this point, all of our mobile development has been done at Chair. The idea of having our own mobile game, having this sort of thing that would be sort of a palate cleanser between the Gears games was really interesting. And then as they continued to develop, we were sort of like, well, why do we need 2 fantasy IPs? It makes more sense to kind of roll this under the Infinity Blade umbrella. Sort of there's 2 main activities in dungeons. There's the actual dungeon crawling, or the adventuring, where you go to get materials and experience and gold and all that kind of stuff. And then there's the actual forging side of it, where you make your weapons that prepare you to go and do more dungeon crawling. It's just that it makes sense that the dungeon is about 10 minutes and then forging is a couple minutes. And so based on what kind of time you have, are you at the line at the ATM and okay, I'll forge a sword real quick, or hey, I'm waiting in the doctor's office for 10 minutes or whatever, I'll go play through a dungeon. So it's that kind of keeping it bite-sized and allowing for some choice, that where when you fire it up, you can go, what do I have time to go do right now? I mean, the big thing about dungeons is really it's around the weapons. The way I think about the game is that I always think of the weapons as sort of Pokemon in a way, that you're trying to collect these weapons in the sense that you collect patterns in order to build them, and when you craft them, you can choose which powers you want them to have, and whether you want them elementally charged, and what kinds of attacks do you want on the different gestures. We don't drop weapons. Armor will fall, and gold will fall, and other things, and keys will fall, but a weapon you gotta go craft. And so that's kind of trying to create that relationship between you and your weapon. The controls came out of sort of driven by the team's desire to not do certain things. It just feels more natural to take advantage of the touch interface than it is to say, okay, well, let's take this touch interface and now mock up buttons and mock up a stick. A lot of the design has been about that, about just actually making it for the right platform. Well, dungeons will be, I mean, one of the things we really like about what we see in the mobile space is really this idea of the asynchronous co-op, the idea of being able to interact, but in a non-synchronous way. And to me, if you look at things like Draw Something and Words with Friends, those types of games where the true growth is in the ability to interact with each other asynchronously, I think that's kind of where we're really more targeting sort of the dungeons model. Much like we're trying new gameplay and we're trying with a new team and all this other stuff, we're talking about potentials for new business models or new ways of trying just to see what works and what doesn't. It feels like this is an opportunity for us to potentially experiment, but we've had great success with the method we're using for the original IB games, so it's kind of hard to say let's not go that way. As newcomers to this sort of market, we have to look at and understand like what is actually viable and what can we play with and test and try, and you know, all that stuff requires a lot of back-end work. That's the thing I don't think everybody seems to totally get, that these little simple games require so much infrastructure on the back end, and to allow for secure transactions and all that stuff that has to happen behind the scenes. With a mobile game that has a long tail, you have to think about your shipping as not being get to 100% and then do DLC, which is kind of the way you think about it with a console game. Is now it's almost kind of like you launch your first game at 50% and the other 50% is the tail. It's great to have a franchise that's sort of tailored to iOS or that's taking advantage of that, but I think there's always I always never say never. There's lots of things out there in terms of platforms that we might want to go to in the future, but right now, just having this partnership has been great.